The morning the Iron Vale pack house lost its true Luna, the crimson forge fires were still crackling deep within the subterranean chambers, casting a bloody glow through the grates. Alara did not slam a single heavy oak door. She did not leave a tear-stained parchment behind on the vanity. She did not scream, throw a royal tantrum, or demand that her unfaithful mate explain his cruelty. She simply walked quietly, her boots clicking softly on the flagstones, pacing steadily through the desolate east corridor in the freezing gray hour before the rest of the prideful pack began to stir. A single canvas pack hung over her shoulder, and a profound secret was pressed so close to her chest that she had not yet whispered it aloud. Her name was Alara, a woman born of noble Beta blood who had spent 3 long years as the most invisible, neglected fixture in a fortress overflowing with warriors who were supposed to revere her. She had meticulously learned the brutal silences of her husband. She had submissively worn his chosen crest and his preferred colors of dark charcoal and deep navy. She had quietly pressed delicate mountain wildflowers into a bound leather journal by her arched window, offering beauty to a place made of stone and iron. And she had loved him. She had truly loved Orion, her arrogant alpha king, her destined, bonded mate. She had loved him with the wholehearted, the slightly bewildered devotion of a proud woman who still naively believed that patience was the same as being chosen, that endurance would eventually earn affection. She was dead wrong about that. She discovered the bitter truth on a cold Tuesday morning. It happened in a high-arched corridor that reeked of acrid wood smoke and frozen iron. She was merely walking toward the kitchens, seeking the simple comfort of freshly baked bread. What she carried out of the Iron Vale gates that morning, however, was not just a travel bag. It was not just a hidden pregnancy. It was a completely rewritten destiny, and she was going to forge it in the wildlands, whether the monarchy gave her permission or not. The Iron Vale stronghold possessed a very specific scent. Every werewolf territory did, if you lived inside its borders long enough to let the ambient magic sink into your bones. But Orion's kingdom was distinct, layered, oppressive, and sharp. It was a sensory signature pressed into the ancient stone over generations. There was the bitter forge smoke drifting from the armory, where blacksmiths hammered out broadswords and heavy claymores. 2 corridors beyond the great hall, there was the biting mountain air that snuck through the heavy seams of the leaded windows, bypassing the thick velvet curtains. Underneath it all lay something older, heavier, the scent of blood, dominant pheromones, and raw power. Alara had stopped noticing it over the years, the same way a living creature stops noticing the sound of its own heartbeat. Until the very morning, she noticed everything with agonizing clarity. She woke before dawn that fateful Tuesday, without knowing what had broken her slumber. The grand bedchamber was pitch black and freezing. Orion's side of the massive bed was entirely empty. It was always empty by this hour. The ruthless Alpha King consistently preferred his tactical maps, his war councils, and his private studies to sleep. Or, more accurately, he preferred them to the particular kind of emotional closeness that a shared mattress demanded. Alara lay perfectly still for a moment, staring blankly up at the vaulted stone ceiling, listening to the heavy, hollow quiet that exists in vast castles before anyone decides what the day's duties will be. 3 years. She had reigned as the Luna of Iron Vale for 3 years. She tried, as she often did in those miserable pre-dawn minutes, to calculate what that time had actually been made of. She didn't count the grand mating ceremonies, the tedious council appearances, or the public festivals where she was paraded as a symbol of peace. Those were easy to list on a scribe's scroll, but impossible to feel in the soul. Instead, she tried to count the real things, the small, stolen moments, the crushing weight of 3 years lived as a tolerated ghost. She remembered the harsh winter immediately following their mating bond ceremony. She had walked to the high ridge path at dusk, desperate to be alone with the wilderness, and she had stayed out long after the frost settled. Orion had actually come to find her without being summoned by his guards. He hadn't confessed that he was worried. His arrogant, composed face remained utterly stoic, his dark eyes masking any trace of humanity. But he had simply appeared at the edge of the snowy path, his broad shoulders cutting through the mist. And Alara had looked at him, standing there in the blizzard, and felt a foolish, radiant warmth blossom all the way through her chest. She had loved him fiercely for that single act. She had thought to herself, this is how a king cares, without needing words. She had carried the memory of that night for 3 years, like a priceless gemstone. Then there was the way he would occasionally touch her hair in the evenings, a singular brush of his calloused knuckles before he would immediately depart for elsewhere. Always elsewhere. Always back to his duties, his warriors, or his private thoughts. Yet, she had constantly rationalized his neglect, telling her aching heart that absolute distance was simply the price of loving a monarch. She told herself the true warmth would manifest once he fully trusted her presence, once he realized his Luna wasn't going to abandon him. To cope with the isolation, she had pressed those vibrant wildflowers into her journal. She gathered them herself along the treacherous ridge path, small, precise, resilient blossoms that thrived in the rock, bringing a splash of brilliant color that the dreary Great Hall of Ironvale never managed to provide. She pressed them carefully between the parchment pages, not because Orion ever noticed, and not because it served any political function. She did it simply because she adored the way living things could be preserved without losing their inherent shape. Because beauty, she fiercely believed, deserved to be protected in a world that sought to grind it down. She had also poured her heart into the pack members who were beneath the king's notice. She had learned every child's name in the settlement. She remembered little Perrin, a sweet 3-year-old toddler who affectionately called her Luna Alara, in a garbled, cute mispronunciation, because her full title was too complicated for his small mouth. She knew exactly which respected pack elder, like old Torvin, took his morning tea completely unsweetened. And she would personally deliver it to him before his aching joints could even carry him to the hall. She always thanked Eric, the kind pack baker, every single morning for the warm end piece of the bread loaf he secretly saved for her on a wooden board away from the main batch. Eric did that without her ever having to request it, a quiet gesture of genuine appreciation from a kitchen elder to his lonely queen. Those fragments of kindness were hers. She understood that now, looking back at them from the bleak edge of betrayal. They were not signs of weakness, nor were they symptoms of naivety. They were the natural, beautiful overflow of a woman whose capacity for affection was vastly larger than the cold the restricted space she had been granted to exist in. But at 4:30 on that Tuesday morning, she didn't possess that grand perspective. She only knew that her mind was racing and she couldn't sleep. She knew the bread would be fresh and warm in the kitchens. She knew the pre-dawn hour belonged to no one else's expectations. Dressing in the shadows, she pulled on simple, practical, thick woolen clothes. She slipped out of the master chambers and went downstairs. She wasn't suspicious of anything. She wasn't hunting for secrets or spying on her mate. She was just a hungry, lonely woman walking toward the smell of baking bread. The great hall was completely desolate. The long, heavy banquet tables were shrouded in the eerie stillness of rooms that are accustomed to roaring fires and boisterous warriors. The torches resting in their iron wall brackets burned low, casting long, flickering orange shadows across the polished stone floor. Ilara moved through the space like a phantom, opting for the narrow back corridor that cut through the administrative wing toward the kitchens. It was the shorter route, a path that saved her exactly 3 minutes and allowed her to look at the old oil portraits of past alphas in the dim light. In the shadows, those ancient, scowling rulers looked a little less severe, a little more like ordinary men who had once known how to feel. She was just passing the heavy oak door of Orion's private study when a sound shattered the silence. It was a laugh, low, deliberate, and deeply intimate. It was the kind of laugh that had absolutely nothing to do with humor and everything to do with the shared pleasure of a private, forbidden moment. Ilara recognized that laugh instantly. Zavira, the scheming royal consort and noble advisor, possessed a laugh that was engineered like a dangerous perfume. It was entirely designed. Ilara had endured that sound at pack gatherings for 2 full years. The way Zavira would inject her voice precisely into the spaces where Orion's attention was already lingering, amplifying her presence, asserting her proximity to the throne. Ilara had never allowed herself to think too deeply about what Zavira truly cracked open in Orion's rigid heart. She had always excused it with the patient, exhausting logic of a wife determined to remain dignified. Advisors must be close to the Alpha King, she would whisper to herself. They share a long, complicated history that predates our mating bond. These political realities require grace to navigate. And gods, she had been graceful. She had been extraordinarily, painfully graceful. The heavy study door was not completely latched. It stood open by perhaps a single inch, just a slight, mocking gap caused by a draft in the corridor, or perhaps left unbothered by 2 people who simply didn't care about being overheard. Why would they be anxious? The entire fortress was asleep. The corridors were supposed to be vacant. Ilara didn't rush forward. She didn't press her back against the stones in the frantic, breathless manner of a woman seeking a dramatic confrontation. Her boots simply froze 2 feet from the threshold because her mind refused to let her feet take another step. Her body locked into place, and the low voices drifting from the gap arrived in her ears with the piercing clarity of a death sentence. She still watches you with those pathetic, adoring eyes, Orion. Zavira's voice drifted out, rich with amusement and laced with venom. She looks at you like you are the center of the universe. 3 years as your queen, and she still hasn't figured out that she is nothing more than a ghost in this castle. A heavy silence followed. Alara heard the soft clink of a crystal goblet being set down on a mahogany desk. Then came Orion's voice, flat, unbothered, and completely devoid of emotion. It was the exact tone he used when evaluating cattle or discussing unremarkable logistics with his generals. "She is useful," the Alpha King muttered casually. "She keeps the restless elders comfortable. She manages the servants, and she doesn't complicate my political alliances. She serves her purpose." Ilara's hand blindly reached out and found the stone wall. It wasn't a dramatic gesture. Her fingers simply sought something solid because the floor beneath her feet felt like it had suddenly liquefied. Zavira chuckled lightly, the sound dripping with condescension. "She actually brings old Torvin wildflowers from the high ridge path." "Wildflowers, Orion. She behaves like a simple country servant girl on a holiday, not a true Luna worthy of a king." And then came the response. This was the exact fragment of speech that did not break Ilara, but rather reformed her, quietly and completely, shattering the submissive queen and awakening something entirely different. Orion let out a soft exhale that sounded dangerously close to dismissive fondness. He spoke in a voice that carried no overt cruelty, no active malice, and no weight whatsoever. "She means well." Those 3 words cut deeper than a silver blade. She means well. As though meaning well was the absolute highest ceiling of what he had ever expected from his destined mate. As though 3 years of her warmth, her pressed wildflowers, her meticulous care of his people, and her patient, unrequited love were merely the acceptable, mundane output of a boring woman who meant well. As though she were a pleasant piece of furniture in his grand hall. Something he never complained about because he had never expected it to have a soul. Ilara stood utterly paralyzed in the dark hallway. She forced herself to breathe. And in that breath, in the devastating quality of the silence those words left behind, the countless excuses she had spent the last 6 weeks inventing completely collapsed. Without her conscious command, her hand slowly drifted down to press flat against her lower abdomen. 6 weeks, perhaps 7. She had been desperately telling herself that her missed cycles were due to the harsh mountain altitude, the freezing temperatures, and the low-grade, exhausting trauma of performing marital contentment day after day. She had intentionally avoided the pack healer. She hadn't named the condition, even in her own mind, because naming it would make the pregnancy a terrifying reality she wasn't ready to handle alone in a castle that felt like a prison. But standing in that dark corridor, with her husband's dismissive voice settling over her spirit like toxic ash, the truth became absolute. She was pregnant with the Alpha King's heir. Both of her hands were now pressed flat against her stomach. Her back rested against the freezing stone wall. The scent of forge smoke hung heavy in the air, and the warm bread she had been seeking was waiting somewhere ahead of her, a comfort she would now never go to collect. Her eyes did not fill with tears. Her breathing did not shatter into sobs. She stared at that 1-inch gap in the oak door for one long, profoundly clear, entirely deliberate moment. Then she simply turned around. She walked back toward the grand staircase with the measured, unhurried steps of a queen who had heard absolutely nothing. A woman who had merely realized she forgot something important in her chambers. She closed the heavy bedroom door behind her, locking out the world, sat on the edge of the lonely mattress, and began to think with a cold, terrifying clarity. There is a specific variation of grief that completely bypasses tears. It doesn't announce its arrival with screams, shattering glass, or visible destruction. Instead, it manifests in the precise, highly functional movements of a woman who has resolved to execute a plan before she allows her heart to feel the agony. Because she knows that if she lets the sorrow in first, she will be paralyzed. She will remain seated on the edge of a bed in a castle that belongs to her tormentor, waiting for someone to dictate her fate. Having learned absolutely nothing from the betrayal in the corridor. So Alara moved. She stood up and marched over to the massive mahogany wardrobe, reaching deep into the dark corners, past the elaborate silk gowns and heavy fur mantles that Orion preferred her to wear. She dragged out a soft-sided canvas travel bag. Its brass buckles were slightly tarnished, and the strap was worn. It was a relic from her family's humble territory before the mating bond. A bag she had never fully unpacked because some repressed, instinctual part of her soul had always recognized that her stay here was temporary. She stared at the canvas for a brief second, then placed it flat on the mattress and began to plan with meticulous, cold calculation exactly what a pregnant rogue-to-be required when she had no intention of ever returning. She left the majestic ceremony dresses hanging. She completely ignored the structured, suffocating garments crafted in Orion's favored colors, the deep charcoals, the midnight blues, the muted greens she had begun to wear automatically because she had forgotten what her own spirit would have chosen. She left them all hanging neatly, in perfect rows, which was an elegant, devastating statement of its own. Instead, she packed warm, durable, practical layers of woolen tunics, heavy leather leggings, and sturdy riding boots. Hunting through the lining of an old winter coat, she retrieved a small pouch of gold coins she had hidden away years ago. She had never consciously planned an escape back then. Some deeper, wilder part of her wolf, a part far wiser than the girl who pressed flowers, had been quietly making survival preparations while her conscious mind clung to a dying marriage. She reached for the leather journal containing the pressed wildflowers. She held it tightly against her chest for a moment before sliding it into the bag. It was the only artifact she took that connected her to this place, because the love pressed within those pages belonged entirely to her. The king didn't deserve a single remnant of her affection. Tucked away on a shelf above the wardrobe, she spotted a heavy charcoal scarf belonging to Orion. She had borrowed it once, 3 brutal winters ago, during a midnight patrol when the temperature had plummeted unexpectedly. He had unwrapped the fabric from his own neck and draped it over her trembling shoulders without saying a word. His dark eyes already scanning the horizon as if it were a purely mechanical response to a problem. Yet she had felt so profoundly protected in that brief moment. Alara took the scarf down, holding the fabric to her nose, catching the faint, lingering scent of cedar and dominance. Slowly, deliberately, she folded it back along its original lines and placed it right back on the shelf. She would not take a single piece of him with her. Carrying the packed canvas bag to the threshold, she paused for one final moment to look at the bedchamber that had been her sanctuary and her prison for 3 years. She looked at the window frame, the empty side of the bed and she allowed her heart to feel the crushing weight of everything she had tried to build here, and everything Orion had ruthlessly refused to let it become. Then she turned her back and stepped out into the freezing night. It was 4:45 a.m. when she navigated the East Corridor. Far below, the forge fires were being stoked with greater intensity, sending waves of low vibration through the stone flooring. The smell of burning iron was suffocating now, but she didn't find it comforting anymore. As she slipped past the kitchen doors, she peered through the small glass pane. Eric was already moving through the amber glow of his ovens, a burly, gentle kitchen elder who had warmly called her "my little Luna." From the moment she arrived, he was softly humming a tune, his broad shoulders relaxed in the peace of early labor. On the wooden counter to the left, the thick, crusty end piece of a fresh loaf was already set aside, cooling just for her. Ilara pressed her hand flat against the cold glass window, staring at the only man in the castle who had truly seen her for who she was, not for her title or her political utility. Her throat tightened, but she couldn't risk going inside. She took one deep breath, memorizing his kindness, and forced herself to walk away. Near the eastern gatehouse, she glanced down from an archway at the stone training courtyard below. Zanira, a fierce 17-year-old female warrior in training, was already sprinting her morning laps in the dark, her breath forming white clouds in the freezing air. Zanira was wild, unyielding, and completely herself. The kind of woman the pack would either learn to respect or lose entirely to the wild. "Keep running, little wolf," Ilara whispered into the wind. "Never let them convince you to make yourself smaller for a king." With that final thought, Ilara slipped through the iron bars of the eastern gate, just as the first sliver of gray light cut across the mountain ridge. No alarms sounded. No guards turned their heads. The Luna of Ironvale walked out into the wilderness, and no one saw her go. Hours later, the small valley settlement of Cauldron appeared at the base of the mountain, looking like a cluster of stone huts that had rolled down the cliffs and decided to take root. It was a humble, quiet town, populated mostly by commoners and humans who existed entirely outside the grand theater of werewolf politics. The people here minded their own business, a practiced courtesy born from knowing that the affairs of alpha kings usually brought nothing but destruction to common folk. Ilara possessed 40 gold coins and a human debit card she hadn't touched in nearly 2 years. She used an automated teller machine in a dark alleyway, withdrawing an unremarkable sum of cash so it wouldn't trigger any magical tracking spells or royal alerts. At a weekend market stall run by a silent, burly merchant who asked no questions, she purchased a few bottles of water, a road atlas, and a cheap, prepaid mobile phone. Sitting on a wooden bench outside a dusty tavern as the village slowly woke up around her, Ilara watched the local bakery open. The supply wagons roll in, and a woman walk a massive hound through the mist. She quietly ate a stale sandwich, her mind working with disciplined, survivalist practicality. She was a pregnant rogue now, hovering in the liminal space between a life destroyed and a future unwritten. What remained was only the open road and her own choices. She remembered she had one true ally left in the world, Seleniva, a fierce, rogue-born woman who lived 300 miles south in a bustling, chaotic city where the autumns were warm and the packed crowds never asked anything of a person, except that they pay their rent and blend into the shadows. Selenova was the kind of loyal friend who sent parchment letters adorned with whimsical sketches of stray cats and local bakeries in the margins. She was the woman who had spent an entire summer teaching Alara how to knead dough from scratch, never once pressing Alara about the emotional trauma or isolation she was clearly trying to survive. Selenova had simply made space in her small kitchen and waited for Alara to be ready. Alara didn't activate the phone just yet. She needed to put at least 2 more territories between herself and Orion's trackers before she risked broadcasting a signal. But holding the slip of paper with Selenova's address felt like holding a burning ember in the dead of winter. It was a destination, a physical proof that a world existed beyond the iron walls of her past. The southbound transport carriage arrived at 6:47 a.m. She paid the driver in cash and claimed a window seat near the very back. As the heavy carriage began to rumble through the frost-covered meadows of the lower valley, Alara turned her face toward the scratched glass. The massive silhouette of the mountain loomed in the distance. Iron Vale sat high upon its rocky ridge, dark, menacing, and colossal against the pale morning sky. The forge fires were completely invisible from this distance, but their oppressive memory still weighed heavily on her mind. And then, the tears finally came. They didn't arrive with dramatic sobs or gasps. They simply spilled over her lashes and tracked silently down her cheeks. Alara kept her face pressed to the glass and let them fall. It was a private, unhurried mourning. It wasn't the kind of crying that begs for comfort or demands an audience, but the profound release that occurs when a woman has finally carried a heavy boulder to a safe place and permitted herself to drop it. She wept for the 3 years she had wasted being useful. She wept for the beautiful wildflowers she had pressed in vain, and for the genuine, fierce love she had offered to an arrogant tyrant who had described her to his mistress as a functional piece of furniture. She cried for the warmth she had given away that had never been appreciated. And then, with a sharp, steady inhale, she stopped. She dried her face and folded her hands tightly over her belly. The carriage rounded a massive cliffside, and the distant spires of Orion's kingdom vanished from view. Alara looked straight ahead into the horizon. Days later, Alara stood in the narrow hallway of Selenova's apartment building. The air here didn't smell of iron, blood, or dominance. It smelled of old timber, sweet vanilla, and the yeasty warmth of the 24-hour bakery operating on the ground floor. It was a rich, sweet aroma that rode the creaking elevator with you. And Alara would later tell her friend that it was the very first uncomplicated, truly safe thing she had smelled in years. The elevator was broken today, so she had carried her canvas bag up the 5 flights of stairs. The guest room Selenova had prepared featured thick, soft blue curtains, a serene shade of cerulean that perfectly mimicked the sky just before twilight. It was neither too bright nor too dark. It was simply peaceful. Alara stood frozen in the doorway, her bag resting heavily against her hip, as the utter ordinariness of the room washed over her like a tidal wave. It was just a room, a simple wooden bed frame with plush, clean pillows. A window looking down onto a vibrant street where ordinary people were buying fruit and laughing. There was no acrid forge smoke here. There were no oil portraits of ancient alpha kings scowling down from the walls to remind her of her insignificance. There were no royal colors forced upon her. Just soft blue velvet, the smell of sweetbread, and a sanctuary that demanded absolutely nothing from her soul. She hadn't realized until this exact second how deeply she had missed rooms that demanded nothing. Seleniva stepped into the doorway behind her, gently placing a steaming mug of tea into Alara's hands. Her fierce eyes were soft, with an unspoken, protective understanding. She didn't ask about Orion. She didn't ask about the pack. And she didn't ask why the Luna of the realm was standing in her apartment with a single canvas bag. "You look absolutely exhausted, Alara," Seleniva murmured gently, resting a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Sit down. You are safe now." The silence that followed was heavy and deliberate. The kind of stillness that existed only in the moments before an empire began to splinter at its foundation. "Longer than that," Alara said, her voice dropping into the quiet space of the small apartment. There was no tremor in her tone, only the flat, unvarnished truth of a woman who had spent years measuring the exact depth of her own isolation. Thorn did not offer hollow comfort. Instead, the rogue pack commander stood, his massive frame momentarily blocking the light from the flickering hearth, and moved toward the kitchen. He made bread that evening. He did it entirely from scratch, as he always did when the weight of the rogue camps grew too heavy for words. He went through the whole process with the unhurried, the meticulous attention of a man who understood that the act of making was just as vital as the eating, that the labor itself was a form of sanctuary. He talked the entire time. His voice, a deep, gravelly baritone that had commanded thousands of bloodthirsty warriors across scarred battlefields, was lowered to a companionable rumble. He spoke of his actual work within the Free Territories, the endless treaties, the 3 languages he used to negotiate boundaries, and occasionally a 4th, when a desperate border clan needed an intermediary to avoid a massacre. He told her about a stray hound near the barracks that had developed a stubborn habit of appearing on his threshold at precisely 6 o'clock in the morning, waiting with absolute stillness until its presence was acknowledged before vanishing back into the timber. He described a tactical text he had read twice recently, admitting with a self-deprecating grin that he still hadn't resolved his feelings about the strategy outlined within its pages. And Alara sat at the small timber table, her hands wrapped around a clay mug, eating warm bread while she listened to the rhythm of a normal life moving around her. For the first time in 3 winters, she felt something tight and calcified in her chest begin very slowly to loosen. This was the quiet romance this new life offered, not the grand, suffocating spectacle of an Alpha King's court, but the simple, uncalculated romance of being genuinely wanted. Thorn had told her to come before she had even finished the sentence asking for refuge. He had not demanded an explanation, nor had he required a promised timeline or an assurance that her presence wouldn't be too much trouble for his fierce renegade pack. He had simply opened the iron-bound gates of his stronghold as though the answer had always been ready, merely waiting for her to find the courage to ask the question. Alara thought about that as the warmth of the bread met the cold ache in her throat. She thought about how rarely, during her years under Orion's rule, she had felt simply and unconditionally desired. In the capital, she had been a political asset, a functional ornament. An appropriate seasonal fixture for the spring galas and the winter tribunals. Never just wanted. Never valued across a table on an ordinary evening for no reason other than the simple fact that her presence brought comfort to the room. The stark contrast with the brutal coldness of Orion's fortress did not need to be spoken aloud. The memory of her rejection arrived like a phantom, sitting quietly between them in the firelight, felt entirely without the need for an announcement. Ilara finally gave Thorn the shape of her betrayal that weekend. She did not share all the details. Her soul was still too raw, the wounds of her public rejection still bleeding beneath her armor. And Thorn, understanding her hesitation with the intuitive grace of a true leader, received what she offered without pushing at the jagged edges of her grief. She told him about the Great Hall. She told him about the words that had severed her mate bond in front of 1,000 sneering nobles. She described the chilling quality of Orion's voice when he had dismissed her as an insignificant beta-turned-rogue who merely meant well. The utter absence of contempt in his delivery had made it worse. Hatred would have been easier to fight. Instead, Orion had spoken with a mild, resigned indifference. The way a monarch might discuss a reliable but entirely unremarkable piece of household furniture before replacing it with a gilded throne. She told Thorn about the 3 years of careful performance, the genuine love she had poured into a void, and the agonizing way the two had run alongside each other until she could no longer distinguish where her duty ended and her heartbreak began. The rogue commander listened the way he did everything, completely, without a single interruption. His massive, scarred hands remained steady around his mug, his dark eyes unwavering and unreactive. He was a man receiving everything and calculating nothing, offering her a safe harbor where her pain didn't have to be useful to be valid. When Ilara finally finished, the room fell into a deep, heavy silence. The only sound was the snapping of pine logs in the hearth. Then Thorn looked at her, his expression fierce, but incredibly tender. You wrote about duty in your letters to the neutral territories, as if it were a sentence you were forcing yourself to serve every week. Ilara looked across the table, her jaw tightening as a sob threatened to break through her composure. I didn't want to admit that I was entirely wrong about him. I didn't want to believe an Alpha King could be so utterly hollow. Thorn reached across the table. He placed his calloused, battle-worn hand over hers, not with dramatic flair, but with a steady, grounding weight that promised protection. You are here now, he said, his voice dropping to a low, vow-like register. That part is what matters. The past belongs to the dead. Your future belongs to the free. They sat in that shared quiet for a long time, the shadows stretching long across the floorboards. 2 days later, while sitting on the simple blue-curtained bed, as the afternoon sun cut through the narrow window in long, slanted beams of amber light, Ilara told him the rest. She told him about the secret she had been carrying flat against her abdomen since the moment she fled the capital, the life stirring beneath her ribs. Thorn remained perfectly still for a long moment after the revelation left her lips. His weathered face moved through a rapid succession of emotions. A sharp surprise, a fleeting flash of primal fury directed at the kingdom that had cast her out. And then something far more complicated, something deep and fiercely possessive. Within seconds, His characteristic, brisk efficiency returned, settling into a practical, protective warmth. "A healer first," Thorn ordered gently, his commander persona rising to the surface to shield her. "Everything else comes after we ensure the strength of the child." The practitioner they sought worked out of a quiet, obscured clinic 3 valleys away, tucked into the rugged terrain where the rogue territories bled into the neutral borderlands. This was a place found only through a network of outcasts who existed in the spaces between the ordinary world and the royal factions. People who knew exactly what the world contained and had chosen to be useful in that dangerous knowledge rather than unsettled by it. The clinic was a haven of purposeful calm. The small waiting room was filled with thriving mountain ferns and wild flora, which Alara took as a comforting sign of the character of the person who tended them. The healer was precise, thorough, and gave the immediate impression of someone who had long since stopped being surprised by the horrors and miracles the world sent through her door. She examined Alara carefully, asking clear, clinical questions while noting her findings in a small parchment ledger with the focused attention of a master who trusted hard information over emotional assumption. When she finally set her quill aside, she looked at Alara with an expression that was both deeply respectful and entirely direct. 8 weeks, the healer announced, her voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "The pup's markers are exceptionally strong, far stronger than I would typically expect at this stage of a lichen pregnancy." She paused, studying the fierce glint in Alara's eyes. Gore-lichen bloodlines carry their own ancient rhythms, especially when born of a warrior line. You must pay absolute attention to what your body feels. You are a far more intuitive carrier than you may realize. Alara thought of the low, persistent hum she had felt vibrating beneath her ribs for weeks, the sensation she had dismissed as mere exhaustion, the stress of her escape, and the accumulated weight of 3 years of performing contentment for an arrogant king. She thought of that internal fire differently now. It wasn't fatigue. It was the first embers of a queen being born. At the threshold of the clinic, the healer looked at Alara with a steady, unhurried regard, asking a question that she had undoubtedly posed to many rogue mothers before her. Is the biological father going to be a problem for the safety of this child? Alara considered the question with the cold, calculating mind of the warrior queen she was rapidly becoming. "Not until I decide to make him one," she said flatly. The healer nodded, a faint, approving smile touching her lips. That is the only honest answer a rogue mother should give. Come back to the valley sooner if your hum shifts, and consume more protein. On the long trek back to the stronghold, Thorn did not offer empty platitudes. He walked beside Alara at the exact same pace, his shoulder nearly brushing hers, refusing to fill the vast mountain silence with meaningless reassurance or frantic future planning. He simply walked beside her, present, steady, an immovable wall of iron and muscle. When they reached the heavy timber doors of his personal quarters, Alara stopped, her hand resting on the iron latch. She looked up at the commander. "Thank you, Thorn." Thorn's gaze softened, though his jaw remained set. "Don't," he said simply, his voice rough. "You would have done the exact same for me if our positions were reversed." Without hesitation, Alara replied. They stepped inside, where the scent of baking bread and dried pine needles instantly enveloped them. In the guest wing, the blue curtains fluttered against the mountain breeze, offering the long, specific, The uncomplicated peace of an evening that asked absolutely nothing of her except that she rest and grow strong. And so she rested. Over the following months, a deliberate rhythm established itself within the rogue stronghold. Thorne worked tirelessly from his strategy room, maps spread across the heavy oak table, coordinates open. His communications with the decentralized rogue factions, moving quietly from dawn until dusk. Meanwhile, the stray hound he had mentioned became a permanent fixture on the porch, operating on a schedule only it fully understood. The quarters maintained a quality of purposeful military calm during these working hours. Great things were being done at a measured, intelligent pace by a leader who had built his domain around the survival of his people. Elara sat at the heavy wooden table, surrounded not by the beautiful, useless wildflowers she used to gather, but by ancient scrolls, borrowed histories, and a new leather-bound journal. No more passive waiting. Now there was only ink, steel, and information. She spent her days studying old pack law. She possessed far more access to the historical foundations of the realm than Orion's council might have ever suspected. The independent archives within the neutral trading towns held the ancient legal treatises from the border communities. Records that existed before the centralized monarchy had rewritten the laws to suit their own arrogance. She unearthed the legal frameworks governing the absolute rights of bonded mates in cases of unlawful banishment. She found the documented, unassailable standing of lichen heirs born outside royal borders. She cataloged sparse but perfectly legible case histories of rejected Lunas who had successfully contested royal proceedings brought against them in absentia. She made meticulous, organized, and precise notes in her own handwriting, ensuring she would understand every legal loophole under any circumstance, no matter how volatile the impending conflict became. During her research, she discovered something she had never intended to find: a single, faded entry in a historical legal record from a border council written 60 years prior. It established an absolute rule. A child of the Alpha King's bloodline, if left unacknowledged or hidden before a formal, the legal dissolution of the mate bond was recorded by the Elder Council, carried full standing to contest that dissolution at any future point, claiming their rightful inheritance and challenging the legitimacy of the throne itself. The language of the old scribes was dense, cautious, and heavy with the warnings of ancestors who had seen enough royal betrayals to know that simple edicts inevitably shattered when they met complicated lives. But the core principle was as clear as a polished blade. She read it twice. She wrote it out in bold black ink. She underlined it. Then she leaned back against the high wooden chair and thought about Orion. She did not think of him with bitterness, nor with the clean, burning anger that might have been simpler to manage. She thought about him with aching clarity that comes only to a person who has finally stopped protecting themselves from seeing an idol accurately. She forced herself to remember the bitter winter evening on the northern ridge, early in their marriage, when he had ridden out through a blizzard because she'd been gone past twilight. That man had existed. She had not invented his fierce grip or the temporary warmth in his eyes. The moment had been real, and she had loved him genuinely for it. But love and partnership were not the same thing. Caring about someone during a fleeting moment of passion and choosing to build an honest, respectful legacy with them were entirely different paths. Orion had offered her the surface of the first, while actively withholding the substance of the second for 3 long years. And the specific, unforgivable cruelty of his betrayal in the Great Hall wasn't just that he had spoken unkindly. It was that he had spoken casually. He had dismissed her to Zavira and the assembled lords in the tone of a monarch discussing a minor administrative error. Something unremarkable, something that required no particular care, respect, or consideration. She had been nothing more than a temporary fixture, useful for a season, easily discarded when a more powerful alliance caught his eye. Ilara sat with the cold weight of that realization for a brief moment. Then, with a slow, deliberate breath, she turned the page of her journal and kept reading. The catalyst for their next move arrived on a crisp Wednesday morning. Thorn walked into the strategy room, his heavy boots echoing against the stone floor, carrying an official dispatch scroll in his hand. His expression was completely unreadable, not alarmed, but rigid with a calculated, lethal focus. "The royal spies just dropped this on the neutral network," Thorn said, his voice dropping an octave as he handed the parchment to her. "You need to see how your former husband handles his ledgers." The posting was brief, formal, and written in the clipped, cold style of the capital's administrative office. It had been broadcast to the high supernatural forums that tracked regional governance and leadership transitions. The kind of record the nobility checked for protocol updates the way commoners checked the morning skies for rain. "The position of Luna of the Sovereign Kingdom is currently under transition pending Elder Council review. Not missing, not exiled, not broken-hearted. Under transition." According to the official record of the realm, a living woman had not left. A proud warrior had not been publicly humiliated and driven into the wild while carrying the true heir to the throne. There was no mention of a wife who had walked out into the pre-dawn mist with a single bag and a secret growing beneath her heart. There was only a position, a vacancy, a hollow role on a royal roster, awaiting its next occupant. She had been reduced, administratively and efficiently, without a single royal decree ever mentioning her name, to nothing more than a gap in a seating arrangement at the high table, a blank column in a ledger that simply needed to be filled by Zavira. Ilara set the parchment down on the oak table. She looked at the cold text for a long, silent moment. "They reviewed the position," she said, her voice terrifyingly calm. "They didn't review me." "They treat people like territory," Thorn growled, leaning his massive forearms against the table. "They forget that territory can rise up and swallow an army." Ilara did not waste time on anger. She stood and poured fresh coffee, her movements steady, fluid, and devoid of any hesitation. She was a woman who had arrived at a place of absolute, unassailable clarity, and she required no grand ceremony to acknowledge her transformation. She sat back down, reopened the ancient book of pack law, and looked up at the rogue commander. "We have exactly 6 weeks until the next Elder Council meeting," Ilara stated, her eyes locking onto Thorn's with absolute certainty. "That is how long we have to assemble the vanguard." "The rogues are already yours to command, my Luna," Thorn replied, his head bowing in a gesture of profound, unyielding loyalty. "Tell me who we contact first." The secret communication arrived 3 days later through Thorn's private intelligence network. It was a sealed envelope, its heavy parchment stamped with a mark Ilara recognized instantly, the sigil of the Royal High Vanguard, pressed into dark, Midnight blue wax, a running wolf encircled by jagged mountain peaks. She had seen that mark on every military order, every border decree, and every formal alliance for 3 years. Looking at it now, from across the vast physical and emotional distance she had carved between herself and the capital, its shape appeared entirely different. It was no longer an intimidating symbol of absolute power. It was merely a target. The handwriting on the reverse side was economical, sharp, and slanted forward with aggressive precision. The script of a strategist who lived permanently on the precipice of war and had long since made peace with the body count. It was not from Orion. It was from Viera Ashclaw, the senior military strategist of the royal realm. I know you are alive, and I know you are within the free territories. I will not betray your location to the king. But there are movements within the capital's high court that you deserve to understand before the executioners are sent. I will be in the border town of Cauldron on the 15th of the month, the tavern on Varen Street. Come alone, or come with your rogue shadows. If you do not appear, I will take it as your final resignation to fate, and I will not reach out again. Ilara read the lines twice, then folded the parchment along its original crease, her fingers pressing firmly into the paper. She thought of Viera. The senior strategist had always been an enigmatic, imposing presence in Orion's council chambers. With her close-cropped iron-gray hair and piercing eyes that tracked every movement in the room with the detached, cataloging precision of a hawk, she had never participated in the court's gossipy sycophancy. Viera had never been warm to Ilara, but crucially, she had never been dismissive. There were moments during long, tedious council sessions when those sharp gray eyes would find Ilara across the table, assessing her, analyzing the quiet resilience she displayed, while the rest of the court treated her like a political convenience.
Before moving on, without the sneering disdain that the other High Lords openly flashed,
Ilara had always sensed an unspoken principle in the strategist, a fierce loyalty to the realm itself, rather than to the arrogant monarch who wore its crown. That evening, she passed the letter to Thorn. The rogue commander read it with the swift, efficient focus of a general accustomed to deciphering enemy intelligence, his eyes scanning for both the explicit threat and the hidden intent. When he finished, he looked up, the firelight catching the severe scars on his jaw. Do you trust this soldier? I trust her nature, Ilara said honestly. Viera never feigned affection, and she never pretended to bow to a crown she didn't respect. In Orion's court, that level of brutal honesty was rarer than gold. It makes her words worth the risk. Thorn stood, checking the heavy longsword strapped to his hip. Then the vanguard rides with you. I am not letting you step into a border town without an iron perimeter. She will know the moment a rogue detachment crosses the border stone, Ilara warned. She will know I didn't come back as a beggar. Good, Thorn said, a dark, dangerous smile spreading across his face. Let her tell the king that the wilderness has teeth. The tavern on Varen Street, in the neutral town of Cauldron, was a place built on old secrets and low lighting. Its thick timber beams were stained with decades of pipe smoke, and the patrons kept their hoods low and their hands close to their daggers. Viera Ashclaw was already seated when they arrived. She had claimed a corner table, her back firmly against the stone wall, an untouched mug of dark ale sitting before her. She was the absolute picture of military composure. showing no visible impatience, despite the dangerous nature of the meeting. As Alara crossed the room, Thorn's massive shadow towering just behind her, something sharp and immediate flared within Viera's gray eyes. It was a fleeting, involuntary spark that looked remarkably like relief before her rigid, professional mask snapped back into place. "You survived the wild," Viera said, her voice clipped and formal. "The wild is far more hospitable than the capital, strategist," Alara replied, taking the chair directly opposite her. Viera's gaze shifted to Thorn. She registered the heavy rogue markings on his armor, categorized his lethal posture in a single practiced sweep, and then returned her focus to Alara without a single comment on his presence. She knew exactly who he was, and she knew what his allegiance meant. Without preamble, Valera leaned forward, dropping her voice to a harsh whisper. Zavira is finalizing her claim. She has been moving her pieces across the board for months, exploiting the younger council members' ambition and securing Orion's absolute dependency by being the ruthless, politically lethal partner he always wanted. She is forcing a formal coronation before the High Elder Council meeting, which is now exactly 6 weeks away. To accomplish this transition without plunging the kingdom into a civil war among the traditionalist factions. The original mate bond on record had to be legally and permanently severed. The capital required either Alara's physical presence to sign the dissolution papers or a formal, witnessed declaration from the High Court stating she had abandoned her royal duties without just cause. "Orion is going to sign the abandonment decree," Alara stated, her voice devoid of emotion. Viera's expression hardened, a faint trace of grim sorrow shadowing her eyes. "That is the decree Zavira has drafted. Orion he is being managed effectively. I want to be entirely clear, Alara, this is not an excuse for his actions. He is a king, and he is fully capable of choosing honor over ambition. He simply has chosen not to." "Why are you risking your rank to tell me this, Viera?" The strategist met her gaze with absolute, unblinking intensity. "Because under the ancient laws of the first alphas, you are still the rightful Luna of this realm. The administrative decree that erased your name was a political maneuver, not a factual truth. And more importantly, because there are warriors, elders, and commoners in that kingdom who actually saw you. They didn't see a political function. They saw the woman who kept the territory fed during the winter famine. The woman who brought honor back to a household that had grown cruel." She paused, leaning in closer. "There are blades in the capital that are ready to unsheath for the true Luna, if you give them a banner to march behind." The table fell silent. Outside the tavern, the ordinary life of the neutral town carried on, the shouting of street vendors, the clatter of iron-shod wagons, and the distant laughter of children. "He hunted for you," Valera added quietly, the words hanging heavy in the air. "For the first 3 days after you vanished from the Eastern Wing. I think you should know that." Ilara's hand tightened around the edge of the table. "Did he?" "He didn't call it a search, of course," Viera clarified with a cynical twist of her lips. "He ordered a high-priority security assessment of the eastern perimeter. He walked the high ridge path himself at dusk for 4 consecutive evenings, staring into the free territories. He came back each night with his jaws clenched, claiming nothing had changed." Alara looked down at her journal, her voice dropping to a whisper.
He is a man who has completely forgotten how to want something with honor.
He has, Viera agreed. And that is why his kingdom is going to fall. The strategist opened a small, weathered leather pouch she had concealed beneath her heavy cloak. She placed a tightly rolled piece of parchment on the table between them. This is a list of every high commander, house elder, and sector guard who refuses to swear allegiance to Zavira. I have also taken the liberty of reviewing the ancient codes regarding an unacknowledged heir of the Alpha bloodline during a forced bond dissolution. If the court is presented with a living heir before the decree is signed, the king's authority to dissolve the bond unilaterally is legally shattered. She let the implications settle over the table like a challenge. The 6 weeks that followed the meeting in Cauldron were the most intensely, deliberately lived weeks of Alara's existence. Under Thorne's expert military guidance, she contacted every single name on Vera's list through highly secure, encrypted rogue channels. She moved at a calculated, steady pace, ensuring there was time for genuine consideration and strategic preparation on both sides. She did not beg for their loyalty. She did not ask them to take a side in what the court would undoubtedly frame as a petty, an emotional dispute between a discarded wife and an alpha king. Instead, she asked them a far more dangerous question. She asked them to consider what the future of the kingdom required. Whether they were willing to let the ancient laws of succession be erased by a royal decree, while the true bloodline was systematically eradicated from the history books.
The responses from the loyalists inside the capital came back with lethal certainty.
Eric, the kind old pack baker who had spent decades in the fortresses, kitchens since before Orion's father had even taken the crown, sent back a scrap of parchment with 4 words written in the large, shaky yet deliberate letters of a laborer who wrote rarely but meant every single stroke. I have been ready. Torvin, the respected pack elder whose voice still carried immense moral weight within the council chambers, took 48 hours to respond. His reply was a formal, sealed document containing a single, devastating promise. The ancient law will stand, even if we must burn the High Hall to ground it. The senior healer of the Royal Vanguard, a woman whose medical decrees not even the king dared to question, sent a brief, a chilling message. The Vanguard is waiting for your command. Perrin, the young pack toddler she had once protected from the winter frost, was now safe under the watchful eyes of the internal resistance, his family ready to secure the lower districts the moment the rogue horn sounded. As the final week approached, Thorne's vanguard was fully mobilized. Thousands of seasoned rogue warriors, armored in black steel and heavy leather, stood assembled in the hidden valleys beneath the mountain's base, their long swords and claymores gleaming in the gray dawn. The morning they were to march north, the rogue healer arrived at Alara's quarters. A heavy medic bag slung over her shoulder and her face set with absolute determination. A lichen pregnancy at 16 weeks is a volatile thing when an army marches, she stated, ignoring any potential objection. I will be stationed directly outside the council doors, but I am going with you. Alara looked at Thorne, who stood at the head of the vanguard, his black cloak billowing in the wind. Then she looked back at the healer. Secure your horses, she ordered. We move out. They reached the eastern boundaries of the kingdom by early afternoon. Viera Ashclaw was waiting at the ancient boundary stone, one of the 7 massive pillars that marked the outer perimeter of Orion's domain. Its carved runes nearly worn smooth by centuries of mountain storms. The strategist looked at the massive army of rogues appearing from the timber, their iron armor clanking in a terrifying, synchronized rhythm. Her gray eyes passed over Elara, who rode at the front alongside Thorn, clad in black leather and a dark velvet cloak. Her abdomen showing the slight, unmistakable swell of her pregnancy. "You brought an entire army of outlaws to a legal tribunal," Venera noted, a rare, grim spark of amusement in her eyes. "I learned strategy from the best soldier in the realm," Elara replied, her voice ringing clear across the stone. They breached the gates without a single arrow being fired. The internal resistance had done their work flawlessly. The sector guards simply stepped aside, their heads bowing in absolute silence as the true Luna rode back into the heart of the kingdom. When Elara stepped into the great hall, the echoing space was thick with tension. She had walked these flagstones hundreds of times before, on ceremonial days when the rafters shook with the court's sycophantic cheers, and on cold mornings when the torches burned low and she had felt entirely invisible. She knew every shadow of this room. She saw Eric standing near the kitchen corridor entrance. The old baker's face did something completely unmanaged when his eyes landed on her form. His flour-dusted hands came up, pressing flat against his chest, directly over his heart. He did not speak, and he did not move toward her, but his tear-filled eyes carried a depth of reverence that no royal decree could ever command. Elara held his gaze for a single full second, nodding once with an expression that said everything they had no time to voice, before continuing her march. Above them, on the stone mezzanine, young warriors and commoners stood pressed against the railings. They didn't shout, and they didn't cheer, but the air was dense with the volatile energy of a rebellion waiting for its cue. The heavy iron doors of the High Council chamber swung open. The room was built to project terrifying, absolute authority. High stone arches, a massive carved oak table where the Elder Council sat, and elevated galleries along the walls for the high nobility. This was the exact room where Elara had sat for 3 long years, confined to a decorative chair at the very edge of the table. Wearing dresses Orion had chosen, entirely unconsulted and thoroughly insignificant. She walked directly into the center of the chamber, her boots clicking sharply against the marble floor. Thorn walked a half-step behind her, his hand resting casually on the hilt of his massive claymore, his presence radiating an aura of absolute, lethal protection. The room was packed to its limits. The nobility had gathered to witness what they believed would be the final, effortless erasure of the discarded Luna. Instead, the atmosphere shifted instantly, growing thick with the suffocating weight of an impending execution. At the head of the long table sat Alpha King Orion. Elara had not looked upon his face in 16 weeks. He was exactly as she remembered him, contained, composed, radiating the severe, the stoic stillness of a monarch who believed his own authority was an absolute law of nature. When she entered, he looked up, his dark eyes cold and dismissing. But within a fraction of a second, something catastrophic happened to his face, a violent crack in his royal composure that he could not manage in time. A visible flicker of profound shock, followed instantly by a dark, dangerous realization as his eyes dropped to her abdomen, tracking the unmistakable curve beneath her dark velvet cloak. She had spent 3 years studying the microgeography of his expressions. She knew exactly what she was seeing. It was the terrifying clarity of a king who realized he had not discarded an insignificant beta, but had cast his own true heir into the hands of his fiercest enemy. 2 chairs down from him sat Zavira. The scheming consort was beautiful, perfectly still, her sharp eyes tracking Alara's entrance with the lethal focus of a viper preparing to strike. Her fingers digging deep into the fabric of her gold-embroidered gown as the throne began to slide from her grasp. The massive, heavy oak doors of the Grand Council chamber groaned open, the deep, jarring vibration echoing off the high stone arches of Ironvale. The air inside the room was thick with the suffocating scent of forge smoke, melted candle wax, and the metallic tang of unsheathed steel. For 3 long years, Alara had walked these halls as an invisible ghost, an accommodating wife trying to fit into a cold world that never truly saw her. She had rehearsed no speeches. Rehearsed words were the currency of politicians, and she was entirely finished performing for the comfort of this treacherous court. At the center of the chamber stood Ilara, her posture unyielding, her dark velvet cloak flowing around her like a shadow. She did not tremble. She did not falter. Every gaze in the room locked onto her, but her eyes remained sharp, piercing through the dim, candlelit gloom. "I left this pack exactly 16 weeks ago," Alara declared, her voice slicing cleanly through the heavy, suffocating silence. It was not a shout, yet it carried the undeniable authority of a true sovereign, echoing off the severe stone walls. "I walked out of Iron Vale because I stood in the dark corridors and overheard a truth I was never intended to hear. I heard myself described as merely useful. I heard myself mocked as a fixture that was easy to manage. I listened to my husband tell his mistress that I did not ask difficult questions because I lacked the capacity to be that kind of woman." She paused, letting the bitter weight of her words settle heavily over the gathering of elders and lords. The crackle of the hearth fire was the only sound accompanying the breathless tension. "Today, I am here to show this entire court exactly what kind of woman I am." Ilara continued, her tone shifting into something sharper, dangerous, and utterly captivating. "I am the woman who spent years memorizing the name of every single pack member, not because my title demanded it, but because I cared. I am the woman who thanked Eric the baker for the warm bread every single morning and truly meant it. I am the woman who brought old Torvin his medicine before he even had to ask. Simply because I paid attention to the vulnerabilities of my people, while their Alpha King stared blindly at maps of conquest." She finally shifted her gaze, turning her eyes toward the high throne. Orion sat frozen, his fingers gripping the carved stone armrests so tightly his knuckles turned white. His breathing had hitched, his arrogant composure visibly fracturing as his eyes remained glued to the unmistakable curve of her abdomen. "I did not flee this kingdom because I was broken, nor because I was weak," Alara said, her voice rising with an unstoppable, majestic momentum. "I left because I realized my child deserved a mother who was never spoken of in the tone of a minor inconvenience." With a deliberate, unhurried movement, Ilara placed both of her hands flat against her pregnant belly. The silence in the grand chamber transformed completely, suffocating and absolute. It was as if the collective pulse of Ironvale had stopped dead. It was beside Orion. Zavira sat perfectly still, her hands clawing into the gold embroidery of her royal gown. The scheming consort's face had drained of color, her eyes tracking Ilara with the lethal, frantic focus of a viper realizing its venom had failed. Under the ancient laws of the pack, a child of the pure alpha bloodline is the undisputed future of the realm. Ilara proclaimed, looking directly into Orion's stunned, pale face.
This heir is not a private secret you can bury to protect your political alliances.
I will not allow our future to be quietly erased from the official record, while my rightful place is reclassified as a vacancy, pending your convenience.
I am not here to beg for the return of a crown. I am here to ensure that the heir you cast aside is recognized by the blood laws of this land. I will not be silent. Orion held her gaze, and for the first time in his life, his cold, pragmatic mask shattered. Beneath the pride, something harder and agonizingly honest took its place, the face of a tyrant who realized, with terrifying clarity, that he had discarded his ultimate legacy. The silence stretched until Torvin, the eldest of the council, leaned forward against the long table. His voice cracked with heavy gravity. The royal recognition will be entered formally into the pack record today. Before this chamber disperses. Before? Ilara demanded, her hands dropping to her sides as she stood like an immovable pillar at the center of the room. The formal entry was written down that very afternoon. Real ink was pressed deep into the heavy parchment of the pack registry. Signed by Torvin and countersigned by the council majority before a single lord was permitted to leave. Ilara watched the quill move, feeling a profound, ancient weight lift from her shoulders. She did not stay for the frantic whispers or the political recalculations that followed. She turned her back on the throne and walked out through the kitchen corridors. Eric was waiting for her near the stone hearth. He held a small piece of warm bread wrapped carefully in a plain white cloth. He didn't speak. He simply held it out with the practiced, quiet respect of a man who had always known her true worth. Ilara took the bread, eating it right there in the narrow stone hallway, caught between the scent of forge smoke above and the honest warmth of the bread below. "Little Luna," Eric murmured softly. "Just Ilara," she countered, with a faint, genuine smile. The baker nodded, deeply satisfied, a man who had always used the right name in his heart and was glad the kingdom had finally caught up. Ilara never returned to live within the severe walls of Ironvale. Instead, she journeyed to the very base of the mountain, establishing a life in a quiet house with a vast garden. It was a home filled with rooms that asked nothing of her, except to be filled with a life of her own choosing. She painted the walls in her own vibrant colors, planted wild lavender, and pressed wildflowers into a new journal without asking for anyone's permission. When spring arrived, she gave birth to Lyra on a morning when the sky turned a fierce, triumphant gold. The babe had Ilara's pale hair, but inherited Orion's dark, piercing eyes, a striking, beautiful combination. Holding her daughter, Alara whispered a solemn vow. "You will never be anyone's minor inconvenience. Not on my watch. Never." Within a month of the council meeting, Zavira Shadowfang fled Iron Vale in disgrace, her schemes ruined, leaving the castle quietly under the cover of night. Meanwhile, Torvin's voice grew powerful on the Elder Council, ensuring the laws protected the vulnerable. 3 weeks after the birth, a heavy knock echoed through Alara's home. She opened the door to find Orion standing on the threshold. The arrogant Alpha King was entirely absent. Instead, he stood with the contained, uncertain stillness of a man who knew he possessed no right to be there. He entered without a word and held Lyra with trembling, terrified hands. Desperately afraid of dropping the one precious thing he had almost destroyed. He stayed for less than an hour, speaking in a low, quiet voice he had never used in his court, but he kept coming back. Week after week, month after month, Orion returned to the house at the mountain's base. The rigid composure that had defined his rule had been utterly dismantled by the simple reality of his daughter. They sat at the wooden kitchen table, drinking tea, while Lyra played on the floor. Once, after a long silence, Orion looked across the table at Alara, his voice heavy with unexpressed regret. "I walked the high ridge path every night at dusk during the first week after you left. I told my commanders it was a border security assessment." Alara looked back at him calmly. "Was it?" Orion paused, his eyes reflecting a deep, unhurried honesty. "No." She did not offer him absolution, and he did not have the audacity to ask for it. She simply nodded, and they drank their tea, while Lyra reached up to press a small, stray petal against the edge of the table. It was not a grand, sweeping romance, but it was something real, built on the hard, unyielding foundation of truth. By the time Lyra was 2 years old, she had learned her mother's habits. One sunny afternoon, the little girl found a small yellow wildflower growing stubbornly out of a crack in the garden's stone wall. She carried it carefully in both small hands, presenting it to Alara with absolute solemnity. Alara accepted the gift with equal gravity, carrying it inside to place it carefully within Lyra's own journal. "Again?" Lyra chirped, her dark eyes wide with wonder. "Whenever we find something worth keeping," Alara replied gently. "Why?" the child asked. "Because beautiful things deserve to be preserved, my love, especially the small ones." Lyra stared at the pressed flower, then up at her mother with a fiercely independent expression that belonged entirely to herself. "Okay," she declared with total certainty, running back into the grass to search for more. On certain mornings, when the mountain winds shifted, the distant smell of Iron Vale's forge smoke would drift down to the valley. Alara breathed it in without flinching, without a single shred of grief or regret. Those 3 years of isolation had not been a failure. They were the crucible that had forged her into the unbreakable warrior queen she was always meant to be. She had loved honestly, she had fought fiercely, and she had walked away to build an empire out of pure autonomy. Her name was Alara Moonridge, and she was exactly, defiantly, and completely that kind of woman.